It's pretty easy for us to be enticed with new. Like a new car, a new home,
This is cute.
a new job, a new trend, a new look, a new you.
Nope.
And maybe that's not a bad thing, because our Creator seems to be all about new. Like a new promise, a new command,
Hi.
new life, new mercies, and even a new year. God not only loves new, but promises to make all things new. And we are invited into this sacred work. In our words,
Here, let me help you with that.
our actions,
Sure, of course.
and our generosity. So I guess the question is,
So, what's new with you?
So we're continuing this series tonight called What's New with You? And if you remember last week, we talked about how Jesus talked about finances, how he talked about our money. And when Jesus talked about the rich and the poor, and when he talked about how we should handle our money, it wasn't so much about how much money we had. What it was about was the power dynamic that money creates. And Jesus fought the power dynamic that money creates. You see, the people with the power were marginalizing and abusing the people without the power. And when Jesus talks about finances, that is what is in the background of everything that he is speaking about, is the power dynamic. And so when I was 16, I got my very first job ever. It was at a Pizza King restaurant, and it was an old school Pizza King restaurant with the little train that delivered the drinks. Have any of you ever been to this restaurant, something like this? Sweet, yes. It is an awesome restaurant. I love it. They used to have I don't know if they do this anymore, but they used to have the little TVs where you put the quarter in, you turn the dial, and then you could play video games on the TVs. Yes.
They don't have all of them, and they don't have the video games, but the one in New Albany still has the TV and the train.
Nice. Still has the TV and the train. So some nights I got to be the drink person that would put the drinks on the trains and go deliver those. That was an awesome night, except for when people would derail the trains and drinks would go everywhere. That wasn't so much fun. But anyway, the reason I'm telling you about my first ever job at Pizza King is because when I got my first job, I started getting a regular paycheck, which I was pumped about, because now I had a car that I needed to pay for, and I had gas that I needed to pay for, and I had things I wanted to do with my friends that I needed to pay for, and I had some, all these things that I needed money for. And one of the things that started crossing my mind as I started receiving these paychecks is, should I give some of my money to the church? I grew up in a Christian home, in a church where giving money to the church was talked about regularly. And it was this thing called tithing, or a tithe. A tithe is not a word that we use a whole lot today, but you hear it quite a bit in churches. You hear this word tithe. It's like the only place that we hear the word tithe, or the word tithing, or the act of tithing, which is giving money back to the church from what you have. And so I started wrestling with this, like, should I give money to the church? How much money should I give to the church? Excuse me. How often should I give money to the church? And all of these thoughts were going through my head. And so I want to, tonight, just talk about this idea of tithing and giving money back to the church. So I know this is one of those sermons where it may be really easy to check out, but hang with me because I think this has some value for you guys as students that are either getting your first job, have your first job, or on the search for your first job at some point in your near future. And so tonight we're going to talk about tithe or tithing. This idea of tithing comes from the Old Testament. And it looks a bit different today than it did back then. Back then, it basically just meant a tenth, or giving a tenth of what you had to God. In Leviticus chapter 7, it says this: all tenth part gifts from the land, whether of seed from the ground or fruit from the trees, belong to the Lord. They are holy to the Lord. If someone wishes to buy back part of their tenth part gift, they must add 1/5 to it. All tenth part gifts come from a herd or flock. Every tenth animal that passes under the shepherd's staff will be holy to the Lord. All right, lots of tenths and fifths and parts in there. But here's how it worked. I'm going to give you the Reader's Digest version. Here's how this worked. If you grew plants, you grew wheat, you grew veggies, you grew fruit, 10% of all that you grew, you would take to the church, the temple in your area, okay? If you had animals, sheep, cattle, pigs, I don't know that they had those in the Middle East in that time, but chickens, every 10th animal, 10%, you would take to the priest or to the temple or to the church. And here's why they did that. It was actually to meet a very important and specific need, okay? So in the group that they are talking about here, it's a group of people called the Israelites. It was this large nation of people that were following God. And in the Israelites, there were 12 different groups of people. And each group of people got their own bit of land, okay? But there was one group that was set aside that God said, these people don't get any land. They're just going to live in these cities on other people's, and on the land that is for other tribes, for other people. They're going to live in the cities. Their one job is to be the go-between between the people and God. They're basically the ministers, the priests, the people that give everybody else direction for where God is leading them and what God is saying. So what happened was 11 of the 12 tribes had all this land. They could grow their own food. They could meet their own needs. They could provide for themselves. They could handle their life as they needed it. But there was this one tribe that could not grow their own food. They could not meet their own needs because their one goal was to serve the people and show them what a life with God looked like. And so what would happen is the people would grow food and then would bring that food to the church and basically say, hey, thank you for serving. Here's food so that you can survive and you can keep serving. All right? And it really met a very, very important need. Now, obviously, it doesn't so much look like that anymore today because money has entered the picture and we don't need to pay ministers or people that work at the church in food. We pay them in money, and we use money for like lights and buildings and all kinds of stuff. So it would be weird, right, if we were like, all right, I got my tithe. So I got some garlic. I grew some garlic this year, right? I got some garlic for my tithe. And we have chickens at home, so I've got a dozen eggs here as my tithe. So here's a dozen eggs. And we grew turkeys this year, so here's a couple pounds of turkey meat. We've got a turkey. We've got our tithe there. And then we also grew out chickens this year, so here's a whole chicken. And this is my tithe. Now, what would it look like if I came in on a Sunday morning and our senior minister, his name is Chris, if I was like, Chris, I got my tithe here. Where do you want me to put it? I got those little black boxes back on the back wall. I'm not sure this is going to fit inside those little black boxes. Where do you want me to put my offering? We as a church staff wouldn't really know what to do with this. Like, yeah, we could give it to someone on staff and say, you have a meal for your family. But tithing looks different now than it did back when tithing was first started. Because when the people brought all of this, I don't want to drop the eggs, but when the people brought all of this to the church, the Levites used this to survive. The people that worked at the church it was a very specific purpose, and they used it to survive. Let me set all this down very carefully now. We'll set the chicken. Ooh, that was close. We'll set the chicken up like that. All right. So obviously, things have changed in our society. But it's important to understand when you hear this word tithe, we often think of the offering plate going around and throwing money in. Originally, this is what that looked like. It served a very direct, specific purpose to meet the needs of the people that were just taking care of the people and doing God's work in the church. And this is the world that Jesus entered. Jesus entered a world where this was still happening, but a little bit different. You see, at the point that Jesus entered, people were still doing this, but money had also entered the picture. And so people were also paying money. And then this tithing process and the priests could set the percentage of the tithe. You may remember from last week, we had Ava come up here, and she was the high priest, and she said, you owe me 23% of everything that you own. And what happened was the people that worked in the church, instead of just meeting their needs, they became the rich. They became the powerful. And they could say, you owe me a tithe of 23%. And tithing became less about meeting a need, and it became more of a brand to say, I'm close to God. Tithing began to change when Jesus entered the world because the power dynamic was going on, and people could say, you are a good God follower if you give us your money. Jesus had a real problem with that. And so Jesus came to address the power dynamic that was going on. And when you begin to look at what Jesus actually said about giving and tithing, you actually don't see Jesus saying a whole lot about giving a certain percentage. You don't see Jesus saying a whole lot that you have to give a certain way. When Jesus talks about finances, he talks about how finances affect our heart and our relationship with God and our relationship with others. We see Jesus say things like this, Matthew chapter 6, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Again, in Matthew chapter 6:24, no one can serve two masters. You cannot serve both God and money. Matthew chapter 23, you're willing to give. He was talking to the Pharisees at this point, but you ignore the more important things of justice and peace and faith. You should have given without forgetting those more important things. When Jesus talks about money, his concern was less about the amount of money given. It was less about a certain percentage you bring in, and it was more about your relationship with God and your relationship with others. So here's the big question. What does that mean for us today? Like, do we continue to follow the tithe? Does it look like this? And these are questions people have wrestled with for ages. Does it look like 10% of my net or my gross income? Before taxes, after taxes? Should I give when I get gifts? Should I give when I get refunds? And all of these questions come into play. And I think as we wrestle with these questions, in some sense, we miss the point entirely. Because giving is not so much about a certain percentage. For Jesus, it's always about our heart and our relationship with God. And the people of the early church wrestled with this. After Jesus died and rose and went up into heaven, people went out and spread his message. Are you boys paying attention? People went out and spread his message. They went out and they started churches, and they started showing people this incredible thing that Jesus started. And that required some finances. And so the early church, these churches that were started to wrestle with this, like, how do we give? We don't want to repeat the problems that we had in the past where we create a power dynamic. So what does giving and what should giving look like in the early church? And Paul addresses this. Paul was like the guy that went and started a whole bunch of churches, very well respected in the early church. And he says this in 2 Corinthians, everyone should give whatever they have decided in their heart. They shouldn't give with hesitation or because of pressure, because God loves a cheerful giver. Now, if you go to 2 Corinthians chapter 9, you read the verses around this, you'll see that Paul is encouraging the church to give generously. He's like, hey, some great things are happening in our church. It's absolutely incredible. Please give. Give as much as you're willing to give. We would love your gifts. But here's the thing. I only want you to give if you want to. Paul never laid out a percentage. Paul never said you have to give this much. Paul never said if you have this much, you have to give this much of what you have. He just said, whatever you decide to give, do it cheerfully. And then he adds this, which is absolutely incredible. He says, listen, if you're hesitant to give, don't give. We don't need your gift. If you're feeling pressure to give, like if someone is standing up there and they're like, you better give or else, or you're feeling like they're coming down on you for not giving, we don't need your gift. But if you want to partner with us, if you see some great things happening and you want to see some more great things happening, we would love for you to come alongside us and partner with us and give a little bit, whatever you decide to give. It's a joyous thing. And this, guys, growing up in 90s Christian culture in a church, this rocks my world. Because for years, giving has been like any other bill that I pay. Well, I just give to the church. What does it look like to say, I'm going to decide to give this much? And man, just because I love what they're doing and, great things are happening. And there's no guilt associated if I say, I just don't have it right now. Here's what I think. I think that churches have a lot of fear. And I can speak from experience. Like, my income for my family comes from how much is given by the congregation. And there can be fear associated with that if I don't say, you got to give, or I'm not, where's my paycheck coming from? There's fear there. But what if we changed the conversation? What if we took away the fear and we said, listen, God's going to do it. You want to give? You want to partner? Awesome. You don't have it? You don't want to partner? You don't want to give? Awesome. And here's the thing. God's love for you, for me, is not dependent on how much money you give. God's grace is not dependent on how much money you give. His relationship with you is not going to be any different. He's not going to step back or move away from you if you decide not to give. That's power dynamic talk. The truth is, we just have an opportunity to partner. We have an opportunity to say, man, there's some awesome things happening. I think I want to do that. Not only in the church, but in local nonprofits and people that we see around that maybe just need some help. Like there's some good people and they just need some help, so we want to give to them. What if we changed the conversation? And you guys, this is not a popular stance on giving. And my guess is that when you go back to either this church on Sunday mornings or your own churches on Sunday mornings and you pay attention to sermons on giving, you're not going to hear necessarily this. But when you give cheerfully, when you take away the fear, when you take away the pressure, man, there's freedom in that. There's freedom in that. When we have the opportunity to do something just because we want to, isn't that so much better than doing it because our parents said, no, I need you to do this? Like there's so much freedom and just joy that comes from that. And that is what God wants us to experience as we give. Now, I recognize that some of you are far from getting jobs and paychecks. But I think this is an important concept to just keep in the back of your mind rolling around. If you have the opportunity to give, incredible things are going to happen. Things like See How I Move, See How I Mix, Open Gym, Worship Uncoiled, the meals that we have, the game nights that we have, the events that we do, this building, it all happens because people give. We have an opportunity to partner with that. But there should be no pressure. There should be no fear. There should be no guilt associated with that. Paul is very clear. He says, man, just be cheerful. Don't give out of hesitation. Don't give out of duty. Don't give out of pressure. Don't give out of guilt. Just if you want to give, give. And I think that if we could change the conversation, that it would change the way that people choose to give. And so I want to encourage you guys, you are going to grow up, you are going to get jobs, you are going to wrestle with this idea of giving. I want you to notice the fear. I want you to notice the pressure. I want you to notice inside of yourself when someone is like, we need you to give. Because that's power dynamic, and Jesus came to fight that. And I want you to be able to say, listen, I just want to give. And if you choose not to give, I want you to be able to say, that doesn't change my relationship with God. That doesn't change God's love for me. That doesn't change God's grace for me. I'm just going to give because I want to. And because this, the way it originally started, met a very real need. And even though sometimes when the offering plate is passed, or you drop money in the back boxes, you may not see the very real need being met. But when you give, God is meeting a very real need. Things are happening that you don't know about. And you have the opportunity to partner with that. And so I want to encourage you guys, if you choose to, at some point in your life, if you choose to give, awesome. If you don't choose to, that is totally fine. God's not going to love you any less. And so the practical challenge this week is to begin thinking about the way that money has been talked about and the way that you've heard it talked about in churches. Begin thinking about how you wrestle with that in your own soul and in your own heart, and what steps you might want to take to find freedom. Because it's hard. Like, for me personally, like, it's still hard to wrestle with that pressure and guilt and freedom And if you can start at this young age giving out of freedom instead of giving out of pressure and guilt and manipulation, man, your life is going to be so much further ahead than in your relationship with the church than mine is. And so I just want to encourage you guys. God doesn't love you less, whether you give a lot or give a little or give none. God's grace for you does not change. If you give a lot, you give a little, you give none. God's relationship with you does not change. If you give a lot, you give a little, or you give none. Let me pray for you. God, thank you so much for the chance to partner with